wind howled like a dying animal at the spire's peak, a maddening chorus that seemed to mock the team of corporate enforcers as they ascended. Stroud stood at the front of the formation, his heavy boots crunching against the frost-coated metal plating of the superstructure. The air at this altitude was thin, biting, and tinged with a faint chemical odor. Far below, the sprawling city blurred into a haze of neon lights and industrial fumes. "Movement up ahead," Stroud muttered into his comm. His voice was muffled under the helmet's thick visor, but the hardened men and women behind him needed no elaboration. They knew what the signs meant. Their objective was clear if vague: remove any threat to the spire. That usually meant scavengers. Reports of anomalies, a catch-all term corporate liked to use, had trickled in from this high-altitude zone: power fluctuations, damaged support beams, and drones that vanished without a trace. Officially, it was dismissed as structural instability, but whispers of something worse had spread through the ranks. The team pressed on, their armor servos humming softly as they traversed the labyrinth of twisted catwalks and towering pylons. Here, at the edge of the atmosphere, the spire's architecture seemed to breathe. Steel beams groaned under invisible pressures, and faint streaks of bioluminescent residue glimmered in the dark. Stroud knelt beside a severed support cable, its edges impossibly clean, as if sliced by an invisible scalpel. "What kind of weapon does that?" asked Denton, the squad's youngest member, his voice tight with unease. "Not a weapon," Stroud replied, rising to his feet. "Something else." The melodic sound came first, a haunting whistle that reverberated through the metal structure. It was faint, almost beautiful, but it raised the hair on the back of Stroud's neck. He held up a clenched fist, signaling the team to halt. The whistle grew louder, its tone shifting from playful to menacing. "Eyes up!" Stroud barked, his hand tightening around his rifle. His HUD flickered as anomalous energy readings spiked, the numbers climbing faster than his system could process. Then it struck. A blur of white exploded from the shadows, slamming into Laramie, the squad's point man. The impact was so sudden, so violent, that his body crumpled before he even screamed. The creature loomed over his fallen form, a bug thing. Its glossy white exoskeleton gleamed in the low light, and its limbs moved with a precision that was almost mechanical. Bioluminescent veins pulsed beneath its carapace, and its triangular head tilted toward Stroud with an unsettling intelligence. "Engage!" Stroud shouted, opening fire. The air filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons, but the white whistler was impossibly fast. It darted between the team members, carving through armor and flesh. Blood sprayed across the steel beams as one by one his squad fell. Denton's screams cut short as the creature impaled him with a single, deliberate strike. "Fall back," Stroud ordered, his voice cracking under the strain. But there was nowhere to go. The creature wasn't alone. More of the things emerged from the shadows, their calls a cacophony that drowned out the sound of gunfire. They moved with coordination, herding the survivors into a tight cluster. Stroud's rifle clicked empty. Desperation took over as he drew his combat knife, lunging at the white insect dot. It met his charge head-on, its limb slashing toward his chest. He managed to dodge, landing a glancing blow that tore into its side. A spray of glowing fluid erupted from the wound, and the creature let out a piercing shriek that sent vibrations through the floor. But it wasn't enough. The thing struck back, its claws raking across Stroud's armor. Pain lanced through his side, and he stumbled, his vision blurring. He had seconds to act. His team was dismantled as they retreated back to the lifter module. He radioed for backup, but his request was denied. Someone checked a box and decided they all needed to die. He remembered there was escape equipment stored near the central elevator. As the remains of his team fended off the encroaching bugs, he pulled open an emergency kit and pulled open a parachute pack. He put it on and tried to help Jenkins by pulling him back from a whistler, but he was too late. The monster yanked him out of his grasp, and Jenkins' yells ended in a wet choke. There was no one left to help. He leapt into darkness. The parachute deployed with a deafening snap. The sudden force tore at his wounds and blood soaked the inside of his suit. As he plummeted downward, the whistlers disappeared from view, their melodic whistles fading into the wind. The city spread out below him, a sprawling maze of ruins and neon light. Stroud's grip on consciousness faltered. His comms crackled weakly in his ear, the voices of his dying team haunting him as darkness crept in. "Control, this is Stroud." His words slurred, barely audible. "Team is compromised. Target is—" The world tilted and his parachute caught an updraft, spinning him violently. The lights of the city smeared into abstract shapes. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the jagged silhouette of the spire, its towering structure mocking him in the distance. The wind died down and silence swallowed him whole. Stroud's consciousness returned in jagged pieces. Pain came first, sharp and unrelenting, radiating through his battered body. His arms hung limp at his sides, barely responding to his mental commands, and the metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. He blinked against the dim, flickering light overhead, the bulb swinging from a frayed wire like a pendulum. The voices nearby pulled him fully into the nightmare. "Corporate scum," one voice snarled, its tone dripping with venom. "Left us to rot while they hoard the good life." "They say he's one of those enforcers," another spat. "I say we strip him down and hang his corpse as a warning." Stroud's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The slum dwellers weren't just angry, they were desperate. His corporate enforcer uniform, still smeared with blood and torn from his encounter with the White Whistler, was a beacon of hatred. These people didn't see a man, they saw an oppressor, an easy outlet for years of suffering. He shifted slightly, wincing as pain lanced through his ribs. His arms were useless, broken or worse, but he wasn't dead yet. Someone had patched him up, crudely, with scraps of cloth and adhesive plasters. The sound of footsteps climbing the creaking stairs outside the room sent adrenaline coursing through him. Stroud forced himself upright, biting back a groan. His training kicked in, dampening the pain as he scanned the room for an exit. A shattered window glinted in the dim light, its jagged edges a promise of fresh agony. He had no choice. With a heaving motion, Stroud half dove, half stumbled through the window, crashing into the alley below. Shards of glass tore at his uniform, but he ignored the fresh cuts. The alley reeked of rotting garbage and sewage, and shadows loomed like specters on every wall. The voices from the building above grew louder, angrier. "He's in the alley! Don't let him get away!" Stroud dragged himself forward, his breathing labored. Each step was a test of endurance, every stumble a near collapse. His arms hung useless at his sides, forcing him to use his legs and shoulders to maneuver through the maze-like slum. Rusted metal scaffolding and sagging pipes crisscrossed overhead, casting warped silhouettes in the faint light. The locals weren't far behind. Their shouts echoed through the labyrinth of shacks and makeshift homes, closing in like a pack of wolves. Stroud ducked into a side passage, barely wide enough to squeeze through. His uniform snagged on exposed nails, and he fought the urge to cry out as pain flared. Turning a corner, he froze. A mural stretched across the alley wall, illuminated by the glow of a dying neon sign. It was Whistler graffiti, crude but unmistakable. Stylized images of their insectoid forms loomed over depictions of broken towers and burning cities. Scrawled beneath in jagged lettering were the words, "They watch. They wait." The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Even here, in the depths of human despair, they knew about those things. Stroud clenched his teeth, forcing himself to move. He didn't have time to dwell on the implications. The sound of a metal barrel clattering to the ground snapped him back to the present. A group of slum dwellers had rounded the corner, their makeshift weapons glinting in the faint light. Their eyes burned with hatred and desperation. "There he is," one shouted. Stroud's instincts took over. He kicked a stack of debris toward them, buying a precious few seconds as they stumbled. Then he bolted, weaving through the alleyways. His vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss, but he kept moving, driven by the primal need to survive. The chase carried him through a nightmare of rusted walkways and sagging platforms. He stumbled across a bridge made of scavenged planks, its boards creaking ominously with each step. A glance over his shoulder confirmed the locals were still pursuing, their rage undiminished. Ahead, he spotted an abandoned building, its door hanging loosely from its hinges, the windows shattered. Stroud veered toward it, collapsing inside just as his legs gave out. He crawled to the corner, pressing himself against the wall, his ragged breaths loud in the silence. The voices outside faded, the mob losing his trail. Stroud closed his eyes for a moment, his mind racing even as his body screamed for rest. He couldn't stay here. They'd find him eventually. He needed a plan, a way to survive beyond this moment. Through the haze of pain, a memory surfaced. A safe house. It was a relic from his early days as an enforcer, a bolt hole on the edge of the slums where agents could lie low. If he could make it there, he'd have a chance to regroup. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Stroud pushed himself upright. Each step was agony, his body threatening to collapse under its own weight. But he moved forward, driven by sheer willpower. The safe house was miles away. Hours later, he staggered through the door of the nondescript building, collapsing onto the floor. The safe house was as he remembered, bare bones with a cot, a medical kit, and a stash of emergency supplies. Stroud fumbled with the med kit, his trembling hands barely able to open it. He injected himself with a painkiller, the sharp prick of the needle, a cruel but necessary relief. As the drug took effect, dulling the edges of his pain, Stroud stared at his broken arms. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. He thought of the white insectoid, of the corporation that had sent him to die, and of the slum dwellers whose desperation had nearly ended him. "I'll survive this," he growled through clenched teeth, "and I'll make them all pay." The room spun as exhaustion overtook him, but the fire in his chest refused to dim. Stroud passed out on the cold floor, his mind already forming the first pieces of his plan. The black market clinic wasn't marked by signs or neon lights, only by whispers. Buried deep within the slums, it hid behind a facade of decrepit housing blocks and abandoned warehouses. Stroud limped through narrow alleys, his body still broken but his mind sharp. He had followed every lead, bribed informants, and tracked rumors to reach this place. The door was rusted metal and the faint hum of machinery leaked through the cracks. Stroud knocked once, then twice more in quick succession. It took everything he had. A hidden camera whirred to life, its lens focusing on his bloodied face and battered body. A buzzer sounded, and the door creaked open. Inside the clinic was a juxtaposition of advanced technology and squalor. Surgical tools gleamed under harsh overhead lights, while the floor was stained with oil and dried blood. The air smelled of burnt plastic and antiseptic. Stroud's eyes locked onto a figure at the back of the room. An elderly man with a shock of silver hair, his face illuminated by the cold glow of a holographic display. The man turned, his gaze dissecting Stroud in an instant. "You look like death," he said flatly, wiping his hands on a grease-streaked apron. "And you're dripping on my floor." Stroud stepped forward, his voice gravelly. "I need arms." The man, known only as Kestrel, raised an eyebrow. "Cybernetics don't come cheap, especially the kind I bet you're looking for." Stroud leaned against a workbench, ignoring the wave of pain that shot through him. "I don't care about the cost. I need them strong, fast, designed to kill whistlers." "That's what people are calling them, right?" Kestrel's expression darkened at the mention of the creatures. "You're insane. What weapon can kill a rumor?" he said, shaking his head. "But I like insane. Means you'll pay whatever I ask. Let's talk terms." As Kestrel prepared for the procedure, Stroud described his vision. The prosthetics would be more than replacements. They would be weapons. Reinforced plating for durability, retractable blades for close combat, integrated shock emitters to disrupt the Whistler's bioelectric systems. Every detail was meticulously planned, every feature tailored to turn Stroud into a living weapon. The procedure was a waking nightmare. Stroud gritted his teeth as the machines whirred and clamped around his ruined arms, the pain raw and unrelenting. Kestrel worked with brutal efficiency, cutting away what remained of flesh and bone to fuse steel and circuitry to his body. The new arms glinted under the sterile light, their black metal sleek and deadly. "It will take a couple of months before you reach peak performance," Kestrel said after the surgery was complete. Stroud flexed his new fingers, feeling the power coursing through them. The pain was still there, a dull throb in the background, but it was drowned out by a newfound sense of purpose. He clenched his fists, the mechanisms humming softly, and whispered, "Perfect." The arena was a pit of desperation and violence, hidden beneath the ruins of a collapsed overpass. Crowds gathered in the shadows, their faces illuminated by the flicker of neon signs and crude torches. They came for blood, placing bets on the hopeless and cheering for the inevitable slaughter. Stroud stood in the center of the pit, his cybernetic arms gleaming under the lights. Across from him, the gate rattled open, and a Whistler emerged. Its glossy exoskeleton reflected the glow of the arena, its bladed fingers twitching with anticipation. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with tension. The fight began in a blur of movement. The Whistler lunged, but Stroud blocked it, his new arms reacting faster than his organic ones ever could. He countered with a brutal strike, his fist colliding with the creature's side. The impact sent it skidding across the pit, its bioluminescent blood spraying the ground. But the Whistler recovered quickly, its melodic whistle turning into an aggressive screech. It leaped toward him, its limbs flashing like blades. Stroud raised his arm, the retractable knives snapping into place, just in time to parry the attack. Sparks flew as metal met carapace, the clash echoing through the arena. The fight was brutal, a test of Stroud's endurance and his cybernetics capabilities. Every move was calculated, every strike precise. When the Whistler finally collapsed, its body twitching in the dirt, the crowd erupted into cheers. Stroud stood over it, his chest heaving, his fist stained with its glowing blood. This was only one fight of countless. Whistler arena fights were once considered a death sentence to any human fighting them, but Stroud and his modifications changed all that. A high-stakes but viable sport. Over the coming months he fought in dozens of matches against humans and Whistlers. And with victory came money, enough to buy his freedom from the fight circuit, and enough experience to carry out his own plan. In the dimly lit quarters he called home, Stroud sat at a crude workbench, one of his new arms resting on the surface. He replayed the fights in his mind, analyzing every movement, every mistake. But his thoughts were interrupted by memories, flashes of his team, their faces twisted in terror as the white Whistler tore through them. He remembered the betrayal, the cold indifference of his superiors who had sent them to die. The rage that had been simmering since his fall threatened to consume him. Stroud clenched his fists, the mechanical joints grinding softly. "You'll pay for this," he resolved. Between fights, Stroud pieced together the truth. He bribed informants, hacked into corporate databases, and interrogated Medina gang contacts. The White Whistler wasn't just an anomaly. It was a product of corporate experiments. His former employers had been studying the creatures, pushing the boundaries of their understanding in search of profit and power. The revelation only fueled his determination. Stroud didn't just want revenge. He wanted to dismantle the system that had created the monsters and abandoned him to die. His network in the underworld had grown vast. A web of informants, mercenaries, and shadowy contacts who operated outside the corporate machine. It was through one of these connections, a smuggler with ties to the Medina gang, that he first heard whispers of the convoy, a shipment carrying Whistler materials, carefully concealed within layers of legitimate cargo. But this shipment wasn't just another clandestine operation. It was an insight into the corporation's dark experiments, containing records, biological samples, and the intelligence he needed to track the White Whistler. This was his chance to uncover the truth and deliver a blow to the corporation that had betrayed him. He had a new team now and more power than ever before. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the edges of the city in muted hues, Stroud descended from the rooftop. His team was ready, their gear packed and their resolve hardened. The air crackled with tension as they moved out, slipping through the shadows of the city toward the convoy's route. This was more than a mission. It was the culmination of everything Stroud had become. A battle not just for vengeance but for survival, in a world that had discarded him. And as they disappeared into the labyrinth of ruins and industrial decay, Stroud knew one thing with certainty. The system that had tried to break him would soon learn what it meant to face a man who had nothing left to lose.